The call came in at 2:17 in the morning. Not the kind of call that woke Sergeant First Class Bowen Tate from a dead sleep. He hadn't been sleeping. He'd been sitting in the dark corner of the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center's trauma bay, still in the clothes he'd worn on the helicopter that brought him in from Bagram, still smelling like jet fuel and dried blood that wasn't entirely his own. His eyes were open. His chest was rising and falling, and that was the most anyone could say about him. The night charge nurse, a stocky man named Ferris who'd worked the trauma floor for 11 years, walked past Tate's bay at 2:19 and made a note in the chart. Patient awake. Unresponsive to verbal stimulation. Vitals stable, no change. He'd written that same note 6 times in the past 18 hours. The attending physician, Dr. Halverson, a tall, soft-spoken internist with a reputation for being meticulous and a quiet intolerance for uncertainty, had already ordered 3 rounds of imaging, 2 neurology consults, and 1 psychiatric evaluation. The neurologist found nothing. The psychiatrist said the patient wasn't dissociating in any recognizable pattern. The imaging showed a man whose brain was, structurally speaking, entirely intact. What none of them could explain was why Bowen Tate, 31 years old, Special Forces medic, 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, was lying in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling like a man who had made a private decision to stop existing. His breathing was shallow, not dangerously so. Not yet, but the curve on the cardiac monitor had developed a rhythm that the nurses called the drift, which wasn't a clinical term but described precisely what it looked like. A signal slowly pulling away from shore. Dr. Halverson called the family contact number at 2:31. No answer. At 2:44, he stood at the foot of Tate's bed with his arms crossed and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "I don't know what's happening to this man." That was the moment Neva Strand walked in. She wasn't supposed to be there. Neva had transferred to Landstuhl 6 weeks earlier on a temporary assignment, a cross-training rotation between military and civilian nursing programs that someone in the DoD had decided was a good idea, and that nobody on the ground had particularly wanted. She was 28. She was thin in the way that suggested she forgot to eat when she was thinking hard about something. Her badge said RN, temporary rotation, in letters that were slightly too small, as though even her credentials had been issued with hesitation. In 6 weeks, she had not made a single lasting impression on anyone in the trauma wing. She did her charting on time. She didn't argue. She answered pages quickly and asked reasonable questions and moved through the floor like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Ferris, the charge nurse, had told a colleague 2 weeks in that the new rotation nurse was competent but quiet, which, in trauma floor language, was approximately the nicest thing you could say about someone you'd already half forgotten. She was supposed to be on break. She had come back early because she'd left her water bottle near the nurse's station, and she'd been thirsty, and those 2 facts, the thirst and the forgotten bottle, were the only reasons she was standing in the doorway of Bay 7 at 2:44 in the morning when Dr. Halverson said those 8 words. She looked at the chart on the door. She looked at the man in the bed. She didn't go get her water bottle. Bowen Tate's fingers were moving. Not much. Not in any way that would register as meaningful to someone who wasn't specifically looking. And nobody had been specifically looking, because the chart said unresponsive to stimulation, and that note had been written 6 times. And doctors, like most humans, find it very easy to see what they've already been told to see. But Neva had stopped in the doorway, and she was looking, and she saw it. The ring finger of his right hand, then the index finger, then the ring finger again. Pause. Index. Middle. Index. Pause. Index. She stood completely still. There are things that once you've learned them, never fully leave the body. Languages. Riding a bike. The sound of your mother's voice on the phone when something is wrong. And other things. Stranger, harder things. That get pressed into a different part of the brain, the part that doesn't care whether you want to remember or not. Neva Strand had spent 4 years before nursing school doing work she didn't talk about. The kind of work where her official job title was Signals Intelligence Analyst, and her actual job was listening to things that weren't meant to be heard. She had memorized tap codes at 22, in a windowless room in Fort Meade with bad fluorescent lighting and a supervisor who communicated almost entirely in monosyllables. She had used them twice in the field. She had not thought about them consciously in 3 years. Her body thought about them now. Ring, index, ring, pause, index, middle pause, index, R-I-M-I-I, not random. She took one step into the room and stopped. Dr. Halverson looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm sorry," Neva said. I thought I saw something. His vitals are stable. He's been like this since arrival." "His fingers," she said. "Is anyone tracking what his fingers are doing?" The pause that followed was the particular kind of pause that happens when a senior physician and a junior temporary rotation nurse are in the same room and the junior person has just said something the senior person finds mildly irritating. "His fingers," Dr. Halvorsen repeated. "His right hand. He's been tapping something." Halvorsen looked at the hand. The fingers were still. "I don't see anything. It stops and starts. It's slow. I saw it from the doorway." "Nurse." He checked her badge. "Strand. This patient has been evaluated by Neurology and Psychiatry. What we're observing is likely involuntary motor activity. It doesn't indicate consciousness or intentional communication." Neva nodded. She said, "You're probably right." And she didn't move. She stood at the left side of the bed, 2 feet back, and she watched his hand for 11 minutes. Halverson made 2 phone calls. Ferris walked past twice. Neither of them asked her to leave because she wasn't doing anything that technically required her to leave, and both of them had other things to worry about. At the 7-minute mark, Tate's fingers moved again. She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her left breast pocket, the one she used for patient notes, the one Ferris had once told her was charmingly old-fashioned, and she started writing. She wrote down each tap, the long ones and the short ones, the pauses between clusters. At 11 minutes, she had a sequence. At 13 minutes, she had a second sequence that matched the first almost exactly. She looked at what she'd written for a long time. Then she looked at the man in the bed. His eyes were still fixed on the ceiling. His face was completely blank, but his hand, she now understood, was not. She knew what the sequence was. She had known it since the 4th tap, if she was honest with herself. But knowing something and being willing to say it out loud in a room with a senior physician present were 2 very different things. And Neva Strand had learned, in a series of classrooms and offices and places she didn't talk about, that being right was often the easier half of any problem. The harder half was the part where you had to say it. She walked to the door of the bay and leaned out. "Dr. Halverson?" He was at the nurse's station, writing. He looked up with the expression of a man who had decided preemptively to be patient. "Yes. He's using tap code," she said. "SERE tap code. 5x5 grid. He's been repeating the same word." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the first one. Tap code is not something most people know about. It was formalized by American prisoners of war at the Hanoi Hilton in the 1960s, passed from cell to cell by men who had nothing but their knuckles and a concrete wall. It's a 5x5 grid of letters. C and K share a cell, and every letter is expressed as 2 sequences of taps, a row and a column. It's slow. It requires patience and a receiver who knows what they're listening for. But it travels through walls, through silence, through the body of a man lying in a hospital bed with his eyes open and his voice somewhere else entirely. The United States military teaches it as part of SERE training. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The program designed to prepare Special Forces operators for the one scenario that none of them plan for: capture. Part of what SERE teaches, though the curriculum details are classified, is the psychology of captivity. How the mind responds to total loss of control. How to maintain a sense of self when every external signal tells you that self no longer exists. And how, in certain extreme circumstances, the body will do things to protect itself that the conscious mind does not fully authorize. Psychogenic unresponsiveness, sometimes called conversion disorder in civilian medicine, is real. It's documented. It occurs when the nervous system, overwhelmed by a particular kind of threat, redirects, shuts certain things down, goes somewhere else. What it looks like from outside is a man staring at the ceiling. What it looks like from inside, what Neva suspected it looked like from inside, was something different entirely. She had not read this in a textbook. She had read it in a briefing document, in a building that didn't appear on any public maps, in the kind of file that gets printed once and shredded after reading. But she had read it, and she remembered it the way she remembered everything from those years, precisely and involuntarily, in the part of the brain that doesn't ask permission. Dr. Halverson did not immediately agree with her. This was, in retrospect, understandable. He was a careful physician in a specialized trauma facility, and Neva was a temporary rotation nurse who had just suggested that his unresponsive patient was engaged in intentional covert communication using a prisoner of war signaling method. That's a significant claim, he said. I know. You're saying he's conscious. I'm saying some part of him is. And you know tap code because... She met his eyes. Because I know tap code. He held her gaze for a moment. He was, she could see, running the calculation that most doctors run in that situation. The cost of being wrong if he dismisses her, versus the cost of looking foolish if he takes her seriously and she's wrong. She had watched that calculation run many times. She had learned not to speak while it was running. What word? Halverson said. Does he keep tapping? Neva looked down at her notebook. Still, she said. He's tapping still. Over and over. Another silence. Then carefully, what does that mean? I think, she said, it means he's telling whoever is listening that he's still here, that he's still present, still operational. She paused. In SERE, it's a resistance signal. It's what you tap on the wall when you're being held and you want the person in the next cell to know you haven't broken. Halverson looked at the bed, at the man in it, at the cardiac monitor with its slow, drifting curve. He thinks he's captured, Halverson said. It wasn't a question. I think some part of his nervous system decided he was, Neva said, and that part took over. The argument that followed lasted 40 minutes and involved, at various points, the on-call psychiatrist, a nurse named Kershaw, who had 20 years in military medicine and strong opinions about everything, and the facility's patient advocate, who had been paged by accident and spent most of the conversation in visible confusion. The psychiatrist, Dr. Oland, was not dismissive. He was, in fact, genuinely interested, which made him more useful than Neva had expected, and also more thorough, which made everything take longer. If the premise is correct, Oland said, standing at the foot of Tate's bed at 3:30 in the morning with his hands in his coat pockets, then the standard approach, waiting for spontaneous recovery, adjusting environment, reducing stimulation, is actually counterproductive. The patient isn't experiencing a neurological failure. He's experiencing a successful implementation of a trained psychological defense. Exactly, Neva said, which means the resolution isn't medical. It's communicative. You'd need to reach him, she said. On his terms. And his terms, Oland said slowly, require authentication. That was the word none of them had said out loud yet, and when Oland said it, everyone in the room understood immediately what the problem was. Bowen Tate had gone into a place that was built like a fortress, and the only doors in were the ones he controlled. The tap code was the signal. But a tap code is only half of a verification system. The other half is the answer, the countersign, the authentication, the thing that tells you the person knocking on your wall is safe. SERE authentication is personal. It's not a universal code. It's built individually, in the weeks before deployment, and it lives in a sealed file that doesn't travel with the operator and is not stored in any hospital's system. What do we authenticate with? Kershaw said. We don't, Halverson said. We don't have access to his operational file. The unit, someone suggested. It's 3:30 in the morning, and we don't know which unit, and even if we did, we don't have time, Neva said quietly. The room went still. She was looking at the cardiac monitor. The drift had gotten slower in the last 20 minutes, not dramatically, but measurably. He's been in there for 18 hours, she said. Whatever his body is doing to protect him, it's not sustainable indefinitely. The physiology catches up eventually. Nobody argued with that. So we're saying, Kershaw said, that this man is going to die because we can't knock on the wall correctly. The silence that followed was the kind that has a sound. Neva left the room at 3:44. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 7 with her notebook open and her pen not moving, and her mind doing the thing it used to do in the old job, which was move through a problem at high speed while her body stayed very still. She knew tap code. She knew the theory of SERE authentication. She knew the physiology of conversion disorder and the psychology of the captivity response. And she knew, with a specificity that had cost her 4 years of her life, exactly what it felt like to be on the listening side of a concrete wall. What she did not know was Bowen Tate's authentication. What she did know was this: authentication codes, in SERE training, follow patterns. They are designed to be memorable under extreme psychological stress. They're built around something personal, something the operator knows in their bones, something that doesn't require conscious recall. A name, a date, a sequence that belongs to them specifically. But there's a second principle, one that was buried in paragraph 14 of the briefing document she'd read 6 years ago and had never fully let go of. In the absence of authenticated contact, trained operatives may respond to the correct emotional register, even without the specific code. The body recognizes safety before the mind does. She read that sentence again in her memory. She had thought about it, occasionally over the years. She thought about it now. Then she closed her notebook and went back into the room. "I want to try something," she said. Halverson looked at her. "What kind of something?" "I want to talk to him. We've been talking to him for 18 hours. Not like this." She moved to the left side of the bed, to the spot she'd been standing in before, and she pulled the chair close and sat down. She leaned forward until she was close to his ear. "I need everyone to be quiet," she said. "Please." The room was quiet. She looked at Bowen Tate's face. It was a face that had been somewhere for a very long time. Not blank, exactly. There was a kind of stillness in it that she recognized, the particular stillness of a person who has locked themselves into a very small room and is not ready to unlock it yet. She understood that stillness. She had lived in a version of it herself, briefly, in a place she didn't talk about. She spoke quietly, not in the soothing register that nurses used with unresponsive patients, not the professional reassurance tone, not the cadence of "you're safe, you're in a hospital, try to relax." That tone was designed for ordinary circumstances, and these were not ordinary circumstances. She spoke the way you speak to someone through a wall. "Sergeant Tate," she said, "I hear you. I've been reading what you're sending, still. I got it. Every time." Nothing changed on his face. "I know where you think you are," she said. "I know what you're doing. And I want you to know, I understand the protocol. I know why you won't come out until you know it's clear." His breathing was unchanged. The monitor beeped its slow, measured beats. "I can't give you the exact code," she said. "I don't have it. But I need you to hear something." She paused. "You're at Landstuhl, Germany. You came in on a medevac 14 hours out of Bagram." The bird was a 60 mic with a crew chief named Dobbins who talked the whole flight and drove everybody insane. "You're in Bay 7. There are 8 people in this building who have been trying to figure out how to bring you home since the moment you got here." She watched his hand. "Nothing." She leaned closer. "I know what it costs to stay in there," she said, very low, so that it was almost only for him. "I know what you're protecting, and I'm telling you, as someone who has been on the other side of that wall, the mission is over. You made it out. There's nobody on the other side of this conversation who needs anything from you except for you to still be breathing tomorrow." The monitor beeped. His chest rose and fell. And then, so slowly that she might have imagined it, his right hand moved. Not the tap pattern, not the signal. His fingers uncurled just slightly from the loose fists they'd been holding for 18 hours. The tension in his forearm, the kind of tension she hadn't even consciously clocked until it wasn't there. Released, barely perceptibly, like a thread being cut. She watched it happen. She didn't move. It was another 4 minutes before his eyes changed. They'd been fixed on the ceiling in the particular way that eyes fix on things when they're not actually seeing them. And then, in a way that was hard to locate precisely in time, they stopped being fixed and became something else. Present. Aware. Bowen Tate blinked. It was such a normal thing. A blink, that the sound Kershaw made from across the room, a short involuntary exhale, was almost embarrassing in the silence. He blinked again. His eyes moved. They traveled from the ceiling to the left side of the room to the face of the woman sitting 2 feet from his ear. Neva didn't move. She didn't say anything. She let him come back at whatever speed he was going to come back. His lips moved. No sound. He tried again. "How?" he said. His voice was wrecked, cracked and dry and barely there. "How did you know?" "Know what?" she said. A long pause. His chest labored slightly, recalibrating. "That I was still in there." She thought about the 11 minutes in the doorway, the notebook, the briefing document from a building without a public address, the 4 years she never talked about. "I heard you tapping," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite any one emotion but had elements of several, the way certain weather systems do. "Nobody knows tap code," he said. "A few people do," she said. He looked at the ceiling again, then at his right hand, which was still loosely open on the blanket. He seemed to be checking it, the way you check an unfamiliar piece of equipment. "How long?" he said. 18 hours. Something complicated happened in his expression. "I thought." He stopped. It felt like a lot longer. "That's how it works," she said. "Time moves differently in there." "Yeah." His voice was getting marginally stronger. "Yeah, it does." Dr. Halverson, to his considerable credit, did not ask many questions in those first minutes. He ran the assessments that needed running, quietly and efficiently, and noted in the chart what the nursing staff confirmed and what the monitors showed. And at no point did he suggest that what had just happened had a straightforward clinical explanation. Because it didn't. The psychiatrist, Oland, stayed until 4 in the morning and then said he would come back at 7. And on his way out, he stopped in the corridor where Neva was writing up her notes and said, "That was extraordinary." And she said, "He did all the work." And Oland looked at her for a moment like he was deciding whether to say more, and then he didn't, and left. Kershaw, who had strong opinions about everything, said nothing at all for a while. Then, around 4:15, she brought Neva a cup of coffee, without being asked, and set it on the counter next to her, and walked away. That was the whole thing. That was what it looked like. Tate was awake enough to talk by 5 in the morning. He didn't talk much. He asked for water and got it. He asked where his gear was and was told it was secured. He asked, with a careful kind of casualness that didn't fool anyone in the room, whether anyone had contacted his team. And Halverson said that process was underway and that he'd have more information in the morning. Tate nodded. He looked out the window, which showed a strip of German pre-dawn sky, pale gray with a streak of cloud. "The nurse," he said, "the one who was talking to me." Ferris, who was doing charting at the station, said, "She's around. I want to ask her something." Neva came back to the room at 5:12. She stood in the doorway this time, which felt more appropriate than sitting in the chair. Tate looked at her the way people look at something they're still not entirely sure is real. "Your badge says temporary rotation," he said. 6-week cross-training. You're not just a nurse." It wasn't quite a question. She considered it. She had, over the years, become very good at the territory between answering and not answering, the narrow corridor of true things she was willing to say. "I'm absolutely a nurse," she said. "Yeah," Tate said. "But that's not all you are." She didn't answer that one. He turned back to the window. The sky had lightened slightly. Somewhere outside, a vehicle moved through a pre-dawn road and its headlights swept briefly across the wall. "My team," he said. "One of them didn't make it back. That's why I..." He stopped, started again. "When they put me on the bird, I thought." Another stop. "I don't know what I thought. You don't have to explain it," she said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't ready to be somewhere safe. I didn't know how to do that yet." "You learned," she said. "Tonight you learned it again." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she recognized. Not gratitude, exactly, and not relief, though both of those were in there. It was something older and quieter than either one. The face of a person who went somewhere very far away and came back to find someone had left the light on. "What's your name?" he said. "Your actual name, not what the badge says." "The badge has my actual name." "Strand," he said, reading it from memory. "Neva," she said. He thought about that for a second. "Neva Strand," he said, like he was making sure he had it right. "That's the one." He nodded slowly. He turned back to the window. The German sky was going from gray to the particular pale gold of early morning, the color that happens before the world fully decides to be day. Okay, Bowen Tate said. Okay. It wasn't directed at her, or at the room, or at any particular thing. It was the sound of a man recalibrating, checking his instruments, deciding, slowly, and with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been a very long way away, that the coordinates he was getting were probably accurate, that the place he had landed was real, that he was, in fact, still here. Neva stood in the doorway for another minute, then left him to the window and the morning coming in, and went to finish her notes before the shift changed, and the day started, and the world moved on in the ordinary way that the world does, carrying its extraordinary things quietly inside it, the way it always has.